Someone said it once in a comment thread about growing up in the 90s. They wrote, "Nobody ever mentions the calm, the happiness, and the excitement that permeated the air." They meant the air itself, the quality of being outside in a place you knew completely, before you understood that knowing a place completely was something you could lose. This video is about the mental map you carried before you owned a phone. Every shortcut, every neighbor's name, the precise route home from the park when the lights started changing. If you were born somewhere between the late 1970s and the early 1990s, and you had an outdoor childhood before smartphones restructured it, you had this map. It's a geography window more than a technology window. Whether you were born in 1978 or 1992, if you were outside, unsupervised, and you knew the block, you had one. Most of you still do. The map doesn't decay the way phone numbers do. It was encoded differently, in a part of the cognitive architecture that stores spatial and social memory together, and it tends to come back complete when the right trigger arrives. Someone else wrote in the same thread, 43 years old, walking through a park on an October afternoon. A basketball game was winding down on the far court. The light was doing what October light does at around 4 in the afternoon. Low and specific, warm in a narrow band near the horizon, and already blue and cooling above it. It hit him before he could prepare for it. He wasn't thinking about childhood, he was just walking. Then the quality of the light changed, and something in his nervous system responded before his conscious mind had time to name what it was responding to. He was navigating home. The route that assembled in his head was 20 years old, belonging to a neighborhood he'd left in his early 20s. But the program had loaded anyway. Which way the shortcut went behind a specific house on a specific street. The section of sidewalk where you went single file between the fence and the hedge. The address of the house with the basketball hoop. The name on the mailbox he'd passed hundreds of times as a kid. The family whose porch light came on at a particular hour with a particular quality that he hadn't consciously registered at the time, but had apparently stored in full. A neighborhood he hadn't lived in for 2 decades, still memorized house by house, in what researchers in place attachment call topophilia, the emotional bond between a person and a specific location, encoded in childhood with unusual durability and precision. Every nostalgia video about this era reconstructs it as a product catalog. Discman, Blockbuster, trading cards, specific TV shows. And does that work with genuine affection? What none of them reconstruct is the place. The neighborhood as a complete, self-organized social world, with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own map. A governed territory. And you were part of the government, long before you had words for what that meant. In the early 1970s, a geographer named Roger Hart spent 2 full years in a small rural Vermont town, doing something that sounds simple. He followed children. Every child between the ages of 4 and 12 who lived in that town. He walked with them through their territory, asked them to navigate, asked them to name their favorite places and their feared ones, asked them which adults lived at which addresses and which shortcuts were permitted. He produced 13 hours of documentary film footage in the process and published the findings in 1979 in a book called Children's Experience of Place, which ran to more than 500 pages and was reviewed in Science magazine that same year. Hart's method had a formal name, the walking interview. He followed children through their own territory and asked them to lead. What he was mapping wasn't just where children went, but what they knew about where they went, the social and emotional meaning layered onto the physical geography. A child leading Hart through a gap in a fence into a backfield wasn't demonstrating a route. They were demonstrating a permission structure. An understanding of whose land this was, which adult from which household was likely to be home at which hour, what the consequences of being seen would be, and who would be there to see them. There's a house at that corner, and that corner belongs to the couple who moved in 3 years ago. The husband leaves around 8:15, and she doesn't tend to look out the front window in the morning. Are nominally descriptions of the same location. In the children's maps, those 2 pieces of information were inseparable. They were stored as one file. This American Life covered Hart's study in episode 157, Secret Life of Daytime, in a segment called The Geography of Childhood. The key finding from that Vermont town, nearly every child had a secret hiding place somewhere, a piece of territory specifically theirs that adults either didn't know about or had tacitly agreed to leave alone. Children's maps weren't diminished versions of adult maps of the same geography. They encoded different information in different proportions, and some of the most important information in them was entirely invisible to adults. Children knew which fence had a climbable section on the east side but was solid on the west. They knew which neighbor left for work before 8 and which came home for lunch. They knew the exact arc you had to walk past the property with the dog, and the specific days when that calculation changed because certain people's cars were in the driveway. Adults knew none of it. Hart found consistent patterns beneath the variation in individual children's maps. Working-class parents tended to give children wider territorial range than middle-class parents, who created more controlled environments closer to home. Boys were given wider movement permissions than girls. The experiences weren't symmetrical, and that asymmetry mattered. But across those variations, the mechanism was identical. Unsupervised movement built the map. The map was built from the inside out by the child doing the moving. The research literature on spatial cognition describes what Hart's walking interviews documented empirically. Active engagement with an environment produces richer, more durable cognitive encoding than passive observation. Walking through a space repeatedly, over seasons, with social and emotional stakes attached to specific features of that space, produces the kind of cognitive geography that activates decades later in response to the quality of light on an October afternoon in a park. Hart returned to his original Vermont subjects approximately 30 years after the initial study. The territorial knowledge had held. The memory structure built through childhood spatial exploration doesn't degrade the way explicit memory does. The phone number you've forgotten, the historical date you blanked on in an exam. Childhood geographic memory lives closer to procedural memory, the same neural territory that knows how to ride a bicycle or navigate a familiar kitchen without active thought. Once encoded through years of unsupervised movement through a specific geography, it tends to stay. When Hart's walking interviews mapped the full spatial knowledge of children in that Vermont town, he was documenting something he couldn't have anticipated would become precious: the baseline for what childhood looked like at the peak of unsupervised range, before the decades of compound structural change that followed. He was documenting the last full expression of a spatial freedom that was already, without anyone knowing it, beginning to contract. Mayer Hillman quantified the contraction. His 1990 study, One False Move, co-authored with John Adams and John Whiteleg, and published by the Policy Studies Institute in London, compared surveys of English school children taken in 1970 with surveys of identical schools 20 years later. Same schools, nearly identical questionnaires, direct cross-generational comparison. In 1970, 80% of British children aged 7 and 8 were allowed to walk to school unaccompanied by an adult. By 1990, that figure had fallen below 10%, a 90% decline in one generation, at the same schools, among children of the same age doing the same journey. Hillman's framing of the underlying change, the average 8-year-old's home habitat, the geographic zone of unsupervised movement, had shrunken to 1/9 of its size within a single generation. That number becomes concrete when you translate it spatially. If an 8-year-old in 1970 ranged half a mile from home as a matter of routine, knew 15 houses on 4 streets by the faces and names and social positions of the people in them, had built a cognitive map encoding dozens of relationships and permissions and shortcuts, the 1990 equivalent was ranging perhaps 250 yards, knew a handful of houses, and had built a map proportionally smaller and proportionally thinner in its social content. The map and the social world it encoded shrank together because they were the same thing. You can't have one without the other. The study contained a comparison that should have settled certain arguments permanently. German children in comparable areas in 1990 had substantially higher independent mobility than English children, despite Germany having higher car ownership. Traffic density wasn't the primary variable explaining the English children's confinement. Cultural choices were: parental attitudes, institutional decisions about what outdoor independence meant, and the specific compounding history of those choices through 2 decades of incrementally reduced permissions. England's children were largely indoors because, Gradually, and without a single decisive moment, their parents had decided they should be. Place attachment research has a named concept for the emotional bond between person and place: topophilia. The scholarship on childhood topophilia is consistent that places encoded during childhood carry unusual emotional weight and unusual durability, partly neurological, partly structural. The encoding happens during a period of high developmental plasticity. The maps encoded in childhood are also not purely geographic. They encode a social world, a set of relationships, a form of belonging tied to a precise location. The house at the corner isn't stored as a location, it's stored with the social data attached. Who lives there? Their relationship to your household, what their presence means in terms of accountability and safety and permission. The map and the social index are a single file. When the social world embedded in a place disappears, when the neighbor you knew retires to another state, when the family in the house at the corner is replaced by people who keep their blinds closed, when the block stops being a community and becomes a collection of proximate addresses, the topophilic bond doesn't dissolve. The file remains complete and intact, with no corresponding present to attach to. That's a specific kind of loss that's hard to name, precisely because it isn't grief for a person or a thing. It's grief for a world that was small enough to be completely known, made of people who knew you back, in a territory where your presence had social weight at every point within it. The block had rules. Nobody read them to you at the start of summer. Nobody assembled the neighborhood children and issued a formal charter of territorial governance. You absorbed the rules through proximity and repetition, watching who deferred to whom, observing which driveway the oldest kid operated from, registering which adult's presence required a recalibration of your behavior and which presence was ambient and effectively neutral. Children writing about this era decades later almost always reach for the word streets, a specific geography with understood governance, where there were understood rules about whose yard was available for a game, whose call it was when a dispute arose, which adult had implicit authority in which zone. Think about what actually determined which driveway became the default gathering point for a neighborhood's outdoor peer group. It wasn't arbitrary, and it wasn't random. Environmental design research on where children concentrate outdoor play identifies a consistent cluster of physical variables: a flat, paved surface with adequate dimensions, situated where natural walking routes from multiple homes converge, so children arriving from different directions encounter each other without coordinating it. Free from territorial barriers that close off usable space, and positioned with sight lines to multiple adjacent houses, giving the space the ambient adult monitoring that Jane Jacobs identified as the foundation of outdoor safety. But the social permission structure was at least as determinative as the physical features. The driveway that hosted the game was the driveway where the adults had tacitly agreed to let it happen, whose household had a high enough tolerance for noise and traffic and the occasional broken planter, whose adult presence was consistent enough to provide ambient oversight, whose social standing in the block's network gave the space a legitimacy that a geographically equivalent surface 2 houses down might not have carried. Whose call was it when a dispute arose mid-game? The question settled itself through a hierarchy nobody had voted on and nobody had formally announced. The oldest kid with established social standing in that specific territory held authority. Authority in that geography specifically, not authority in general, a distinction that children grasped intuitively. A kid from a neighboring block who showed up to the game occupied a structurally different position than a kid who had spent 3 summers establishing their presence at that driveway. The map encoded social standing alongside physical geography, and standing was location-dependent. The same kid who was deferential at the central driveway might run their own operation 3 blocks over. Peter Gray, the Boston College psychologist who has tracked the decade-by-decade decline in children's free play, documented a specific mechanism in the age-mixed outdoor peer groups of the pre-smartphone era. Older children transmitted territorial knowledge to younger ones through the course of play itself. A 9-year-old correcting a 7-year-old who'd stepped onto a property they hadn't established permission to use. An older child explaining in passing, while cutting a shortcut through a yard, that this route worked on weekdays, But you needed to check on weekends because certain people were home differently then. A 12-year-old whose departure from the game in the late afternoon marked the social cue that the game was in its final interval, not because anyone announced it, but because the peer hierarchy was visible and its changes were legible to everyone present. Younger children absorbed the social geography of the block by operating within it alongside people who already knew it. The territorial knowledge of who lived where, which adult had authority in which zone, which shortcuts were available and under what conditions, this passed laterally through outdoor play, 2 or 3 years of age at a time, continuously refreshed by the induction of new younger cohorts and the graduation of older ones. When age-mixed outdoor play ended, that transmission ended with it. The knowledge couldn't be transferred into indoor scheduled play sessions because the territory was required for the transfer. The map could only be built in the place it described. The sociologist Robert Sampson published the formal name for the mechanism in a 1997 paper in the journal Science. He called it collective efficacy, defined as the effectiveness of informal mechanisms by which residents themselves achieve public order, with specific application to supervising children and maintaining public order. His team divided Chicago into 343 neighborhood clusters, each roughly 8,000 residents, and measured how collective efficacy scores correlated with crime rates. Neighborhoods scoring high on collective efficacy had substantially lower crime rates than lower-scoring neighborhoods. The protection wasn't institutional, it was ambient, coming from neighbors who knew each other well enough to act on each other's behalf without being explicitly asked. Sampson identified 3 specific components. Intergenerational closure. Parents knew the parents of their children's friends. Reciprocated exchange. Neighbors exchanged favors and obligations across household lines. Generalized trust. The ambient assumption that people on the block were invested in shared norms and would enforce them informally. These 3 components, operating together, constituted the social architecture that made the block a governed territory rather than a collection of adjacent properties that happened to share a street. Intergenerational closure is what made accountability function at the scale of a child's body moving through a block. When the neighbor 3 doors down knew your parents, genuinely knew them, had spoken to them about you, understood your household's expectations, your behavior in front of that neighbor carried consequences in your own home. The accountability ran automatically through the social network. She didn't need to be watching for you specifically. You were just aware that she was connected, and the network had reach. Reciprocated exchange is what made the physical spaces of the block available in the first place. The adult who tolerated neighborhood children in her driveway was participating in an informal system where goods, space, tolerance, occasional oversight, a warning when a car came too fast down the street, flowed in multiple directions without being tracked. The ledger was never written, but it was dense, and its reality was what made the outdoor social world of the block possible to sustain over years and seasons. Jane Jacobs had described the physical infrastructure of this in 1961 in The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Her chapter on sidewalk uses described eyes on the street, ambient safety generated by continuous resident presence at windows, on stoops, at front porches. Her exact words, "There must be eyes upon the street, eyes belonging to those we might call the natural proprietors of the street." The retired man on the porch wasn't performing a safety function. He was on the porch because that was where life happened in his neighborhood, and the watching was an automatic byproduct of presence. The watching and the presence were the same thing. Front stoops, driveways, and the transitional sidewalk spaces between yards functioned as what Ray Oldenburg, in his 1989 book, The Great Good Place, called third places, informal social venues outside home and work, accessible without scheduling, organized by no adult agenda. Accessible by simply going outside. Informal because no one organized the agenda. Status leveling because the kid from the brick house and the kid from the rental both went outside, and the outside brought them together without a permission form or a booking system. Oldenburg documented that Americans were losing these third places to suburban design and retreating indoor lifestyles. For children, the functional equivalent was the driveway and the sidewalk, and they were disappearing through the same forces. What you actually knew about the adults on the block went considerably past their names. It was a detailed social dossier, built and updated through continuous observation, organized according to how each adult connected to the accountability network and what their connection meant for how you moved through the block. There was the neighbor who always had something in summer, popsicles typically, or cold water, or sometimes just an open screen door and a general awareness that you could sit on the porch steps if you needed to. Usually an older resident. She knew your parents from years of adjacent residence. She had a view of the street from her front window and the habit of occupying it. If you did something at her property line that registered as a violation, it would be reported. But she was also the person you could go to if something was actually wrong, because she was embedded in the right part of the network and invested in its maintenance. The popsicles were almost incidental to what she represented in the block's social architecture. There was the neighbor whose dog ran the fence on the side yard, aggressive enough to require a route adjustment, predictable enough that the adjustment had become automatic after one or two early encounters. The dog was a known variable that shaped the specific trajectories of dozens of daily movements past that property in ways that accumulated, invisibly, into the neighborhood's shared pedestrian geography. You didn't think about it consciously, you just went wide, the way water goes around a stone. There was the neighbor who yelled, loudly enough to be heard from the next street over, with enough specific complaint that every child in range understood exactly what had triggered it. And crucially, every child understood the distinction between this neighbor's bark and their accountability network bite. The yelling didn't translate into calls to parents. This person operated outside the collective efficacy network, which meant their authority had geographic and institutional limits. Their anger was real, their lungs were genuine, but they weren't connected to the mechanism that mattered. There was the neighbor who never yelled, but whose gaze from the front window had weight. This person was connected. They knew your parents from some overlapping point in the social network, the same school function, years of adjacent residence dense enough to generate actual relationship. Their awareness of your behavior was awareness that had real consequences, and you registered it differently in your body than you registered the yelling. This was intergenerational closure made physical. The social network present in a specific window at a specific address, available to observe and to report. Pew Research found in 2010 that fewer than half of American adults knew most or all of their neighbors by name. By 2019, 57% knew only some of their neighbors. These numbers don't have a clean 1980s baseline in comparable survey format. What the qualitative and ethnographic record from that period documents, across community memory from multiple American contexts, is mutual recognition as the default operating assumption rather than the exception. Documentation from Black communities in particular captures the phrase that cuts closest to the mechanism. Everybody knew who you were and looked out for you. Knowing your neighbors wasn't a courtesy, it was the mechanism through which the ambient safety infrastructure actually functioned at the human scale of a child moving through a block. The clock didn't need a battery. It ran on the environment. In October, the afternoon light starts changing quality at around 3:30. The shadows go long. The warmth becomes directional, present in a narrow band if you're facing the low sun, already gone if you're not. The air gets specific in a way that morning air doesn't, colder at the edges of warmth than the temperature technically accounts for. Children who spent their outdoor childhoods outdoors, repeating the same routes through the same blocks across the same seasons, calibrated their internal clocks against these cues over years of accumulated practice. The light quality in October at 4 in the afternoon registers differently from the light at the same hour in July. Different angle of the sun through the atmosphere, different color temperature at the low end of the spectrum, different quality of shadow on familiar surfaces. Outdoor children learn to read it the way a navigator reads a horizon, without naming what they were reading, without needing to. Be home when the streetlights come on spread through North American outdoor childhoods as widely as any cultural practice of that era, shared through the same lateral transmission that spread every other piece of territorial knowledge, household to household, older sibling to younger sibling, neighbor to neighbor, without a documentary origin or an institutional home. It was undocumented oral tradition. It was also pervasive enough that it functions, decades later, as a shared cultural password across the full birth year window of the outdoor generation. Some families used porch lights instead of street lights, a specific light at a specific window in a position visible from any point on the block where a child was likely to be at that hour. When that particular light came on, you had a window that felt like 3 minutes and was probably closer to 15, but felt like 3 because of the social pressure already built into the threshold. The light is on. The calculation is live. The margins are closing. That pressure imposed a timing structure on the outdoor afternoon without requiring any adult to leave the house. Other families ran on voice, a parent-specific call, a name delivered at a specific volume and pitch that carried across a specific acoustic geography was a cue that the outdoor children of a given block could read with fine precision. You knew the difference between the first call, which was preliminary, and the second call, which had a different timbre and meant something different was happening inside. You knew the directional source of calls from different households, whether a call from a particular direction was aimed at you or at someone else, how far from your current position that voice could carry on still air versus windy conditions. This was environmental literacy operating at a granular level, the kind that develops through years of outdoor exposure in a fixed geography, and that adults watching from inside consistently underestimated. The temperature drop at dusk, the particular quiet that came over a block as the dinner hour approached and families moved inside one by one. The sound pattern of a basketball game at the end of its afternoon energy. Shorter runs, fewer fast breaks, the ball bouncing differently, the quality of the competition losing its afternoon edge. These were readings from the same environmental clock, distributed across multiple sensory channels, available to children who had been trained by seasons of outdoor exposure to decode them. The basketball game winding down on the far court wasn't coincidence. It was part of the archive, a sensory element specifically associated with a specific time of day in a specific type of outdoor space, stored alongside the quality of the light and the route home. In Black communities, the same environmental signal carried additional weight. The PBS Archive and the National Museum of African American History and Culture have documented the history of sundown towns, municipalities that formally or informally excluded Black residents after dark. For children in those geographies, be home when the streetlights come on wasn't only a parental curfew marking the dinner boundary, it was a safety threshold with consequences that ran to a different order of magnitude entirely. The same light in the same sky, different stakes on either side of it, rooted in a specifically American racial geography that the outdoor generation absorbed at different intensities depending on where their block was located. For the 43-year-old in the park, the October afternoon light activated the entire associated file. The route home, the social architecture of the route, the set of environmental readings that constituted the clock, the specific experience of being inside an ending afternoon in a place you understood completely. The neurological literature on involuntary autobiographical memory documents this exactly. A sensory trigger sufficiently specific and sufficiently associated with a richly encoded past experience can retrieve that experience with unusual completeness decades later. The trigger was the light. The file contained everything else. The highest engagement comment in the nostalgia dataset, by a substantial margin, accounting for more than a fifth of all measured engagement across the sample, was about burning CDs for everyone on the block. What that comment hit was the specific social texture of a transaction embedded in place. In a specific address, a specific route, a specific relationship built through shared geography over years. The audience recognized something in it that had nothing to do with the technology. Consumer CDR burners reached mainstream availability in the late 1990s. The hardware was expensive enough that most households didn't have one, which made the household that did into something specific in the block's social geography, a geographic hub for a service that required physical presence. The burner was at one address. The people who wanted burned CDs were at other addresses. The locations mattered, not as metadata, but as places you physically traveled to, along routes you already knew, through a geography that already had social meaning attached to every stretch of it. Here is what that transaction looked like in practice. You walk to the house. Down a block, you'd walk dozens of times for entirely different reasons, past houses whose residents you knew by face and social position. You knocked on the specific door, not always the front door, because you knew which entrance the family actually used. which is itself a form of social knowledge that comes from years of shared outdoor proximity. You named what you wanted. You came back in a day, sometimes two. Sometimes you stayed while the disc burned, sitting in a kitchen that was familiar from unrelated visits, talking about something else entirely, because the transaction was embedded inside a social relationship that preceded and would outlast the disc. The disc was almost incidental. The pre-internet peer economy of neighborhood play ran entirely on physical proximity and the social trust built through it. Academic research on children's economic activity documents that children operated within local geographic economies, in neighborhood stores, through block-level exchange, within networks of pooled household resources. Families with children were documented as more likely to share resources within their local geographic network. The household with something others needed, a pool, a gaming console, an early internet connection, a CD burner, became a geographic anchor in the informal economy of shared goods. People came to it along routes they already knew, because they already knew the person at the other end. Research on the digital peer-to-peer networks that emerged in the late 1990s makes explicit what was implicit in the physical version: trust. The digital file-sharing platforms had to engineer reputation mechanisms and verification systems from the ground up, because the default social trust that came from physical proximity and shared neighborhood history wasn't present. You were transacting with usernames whose accountability was whatever the platform could manufacture. The pre-digital version ran on the trust accumulated through years of shared outdoor time, the same collective efficacy that made the block a governed territory. You burned CDs for people you knew from outside, from the block, from the park, from the ambient social world you'd both been embedded in for years. People whose parents knew your parents, whose dogs you'd navigated around, whose kitchen you'd been in for reasons that had nothing to do with music. Trading cards ran on the same logic. Game cartridges, mixtapes on cassette before the CD burners arrived. The specific mechanics varied across the technologies, but the structure was identical. Physical presence required. Social trust established through neighborhood familiarity. Service area defined by the practical walking radius from a front door. You weren't serving a market, you were serving a geography. And when the network went online and the geography became optional, what was gained in reach was matched by what was lost in texture. The specific quality of a transaction between people who had been in the same outdoor space, repeatedly, over years, in a social world too small to be anonymous. The neighborhood social world didn't end because of smartphones. 3 decades of compounding structural causes did the primary work, and the device moved into the vacancy those causes had already created. Mayor Hillman's timeline is unambiguous on this. The decline from 80% to below 10% in unsupervised school travel occurred entirely between 1970 and 1990, before the World Wide Web was publicly accessible, before file-sharing networks existed, before the first iPhone was a decade away. The home habitat had already compressed to 1/9 of its prior size before the digital economy reached into childhood in any significant form. Several causes had been operating in sequence, each reinforcing the others. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded in 1984. The stranger danger concept itself had entered American cultural vocabulary in the 1960s, predating NCMEC. But NCMEC gave it federal adjacent infrastructure, systematic media channels, and an institutional home that amplified it to a level it hadn't previously achieved. The campaign's foundational premise was consequential in ways its architects may not have fully anticipated. Unknown adults represent a default danger to children. This inverted the collective efficacy model at its foundation. Under the ambient safety system that Jane Jacobs described in 1961 and Robert Sampson documented empirically in 1997, an unknown adult in a neighborhood context wasn't inherently a threat. They were a potential node in the safety network, probably already connected through 2 or 3 degrees of neighbor familiarity to someone in your household's social world. The collective efficacy model treated neighbor familiarity as the primary safety mechanism. Stranger danger treated neighbor unfamiliarity as the primary threat. These are structurally opposite premises, and they can't simultaneously be the operating logic of an outdoor childhood. The effect compounded through the 1980s in a feedback loop. Parents restricted outdoor range. Children stopped using the ambient network. The network atrophied from disuse. A neighbor who no longer saw neighborhood children moving past her front window had fewer opportunities to develop the social ties that would make her a resource rather than a stranger. The restricted range felt more justified as the network thinned. The range contracted further. Each iteration tightened the loop. NCMEC's own data, examined more rigorously in subsequent decades, found the campaign had been built on inflated numbers. Stranger abductions were and remain statistically rare, and children at risk were overwhelmingly endangered by known adults. But by the time that analysis was available, the culture had already restructured around the opposite premise, and the outdoor social world had already been modified by the structural consequences. Sandra Hofferth and John Sandberg, in a 2001 analysis published in the Journal of Marriage and Family, compared American children's daily time use between 1981 and 1997. Daily outdoor playtime for children aged 6 to 8 decreased by 25% across that 16-year window, entirely within the target generation's childhood years, in a measurement period that ended before smartphones were available to any consumer. A follow-up study confirmed the trend continued through 2003. The structural dismantling was generating measurable outcomes in the data before the device that typically gets blamed for the dismantling existed in consumer form. Suburban design contributed an architectural dimension. Front walks that once provided direct pedestrian access from private yards to public sidewalks disappeared in large portions of the country's expanding residential developments, severing the physical infrastructure that made block-level social life accessible on foot. Research on children's independent mobility cites sidewalk absence specifically as a documented barrier to outdoor range, a structural impediment that no parental attitude adjustment resolves. The physical connections between private and public children's space were severed in large portions of the country's suburban geography through design choices made across those decades, each of them locally reasonable, collectively consequential. By summer 2001, Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood had lost the informal gathering infrastructure that had organized much of its social life. The communal coffeehouse Urbis Orbis had closed. The record label Wax Trax had closed. The local diner Busy Bee had closed, all within a few years of each other under gentrification pressure. Wicker Park was an urban case study in a nationwide pattern. The social institutions that make a place legible to its residents coming apart faster than any organic replacement forms, leaving a geography of adjacent properties connected by nothing more than a street address. Then the playdate became the structural substitute for the block. Not a supplement to spontaneous outdoor play, a structural substitute that worked differently at every level. A playdate is a planned event. Parent-scheduled, parent-selected participants, parent-determined duration, typically monitored, often indoors. Spontaneous outdoor block play was child-initiated, geographically embedded in shared territory, age-mixed across 2 or 3 years, self-governing, with duration determined by the game or the light or a specific parent's voice carrying across a familiar block. Research on the playdate as a social institution documents that it replaced free time to spontaneously play with other children with tightly scheduled and parent-mediated social events. The word replaced is doing significant work in that framing because the substitution was structural, not cosmetic. The playdate didn't transmit what the block transmitted because what the block transmitted was inseparable from the block's geography. Territorial knowledge requires territory. Cognitive maps can only be built in the place they describe. The social knowledge of the ambient adult network required sustained geographic proximity to develop. The peer hierarchy of the outdoor group required age-mixed outdoor exposure across multiple seasons to form and calibrate. You can't reproduce any of these through scheduled indoor interaction because the inputs, the place, the accumulated time, the ambient adult network, the age-mixed transmission mechanism are all absent. The skills developed in each environment are different, and they don't convert into each other. Robert Putnam documented the adult-scale version of the same structural collapse in Bowling Alone, first as a 1995 essay in the Journal of Democracy, then as a full book in 2000. Civic participation, organizational membership, informal socializing, generalized social trust. all declining from a post-war high through the preceding decades. Putnam's argument focused on adult civil society, but the children's mobility research and the time use data show the same structural forces producing parallel effects in childhood simultaneously, reinforcing each other.
The neighborhood was losing its social density for adults and for children at the same time, and the two processes fed each other. Adults who didn't know their neighbors were less likely to create the ambient supervision network that made outdoor play feel safe. Children who didn't play outside were less likely to create the social connections that would eventually bind their own parents to the neighborhood. When smartphones reached majority penetration among American teenagers, the neighborhood social world had already been structurally modified by 3 decades of compounding causes. The device moved into a vacancy that had been accumulating since the early 1980s. It didn't create the vacancy, it occupied it. That distinction carries the irreplaceability argument to its actual weight. A device can be removed. Schools are banning smartphones. Parents are delaying first ownership. These are real responses to documented harms. But removing the device doesn't restore the thing the device replaced. The ambient adult network has atrophied in most neighborhoods below the threshold of effective function. Pew's 2019 data shows 57% of Americans know only some of their neighbors, and the directional trend isn't reversing. Collective efficacy can't be rebuilt by decree. It builds through decades of dense, repeated social interaction between people who share a geography and are invested in it. The age-mixed outdoor peer groups that transmitted territorial knowledge don't reassemble because a child is sent outside without a device. The playdate structure doesn't spontaneously dissolve back into block-level spontaneous governance. The suburban design that severed pedestrian connections between private and public children's space is still in place in most of the country. What made the neighborhood social world work was built over decades through conditions that existed simultaneously. Ambient adult networks dense enough to provide effective coverage, parental tolerance of outdoor range high enough to allow the territory to be mapped, physical pedestrian infrastructure connecting homes to shared outdoor space, an age-mixed peer culture that transmitted the map laterally through outdoor play. These conditions existed together, in mutual dependence, within a specific cultural moment that combined them. The conditions have been structurally altered one by one, beginning decades before smartphones arrived, and the alterations compound rather than reverse. Roger Hart spent 2 years walking through a Vermont town alongside children and documented in careful detail what embeddedness actually consists of. A self-constructed cognitive map that fuses physical geography and social knowledge into a single, inseparable file. The house at the corner isn't just a location. It's the person who watched from that window, who knew your mother, whose gaze in your direction carried specific social weight. The driveway with the basketball hoop isn't just a flat surface. It's a location with a social history. The oldest kid who operated from it, the permission structure that made it available, the specific form of peer governance that made the game there different from a pickup game anywhere else. The shortcut through the